So Matthew Poulter is presenting Neo Tokyo is about to explode, Akira and the Cyberpunk Metropolis. Matthew Poulter est ici pour nous présenter Neo Tokyo est prêt d'exploser. Et là, j'ai perdu le restant de notre titre. Donc, Akira et la métropole cyberpunk. Matthew.
Merci beaucoup. Et je m'excuse en premier que mon présentation en anglais, ça fait quelques années depuis l'école secondaire en immersion. I hope you forgive me. But yes, when I saw the subject of this conference, I was thinking about the foundations of the city in comics and the way that we think about the city in comics. And I don't think I'm the only one who, when I think about the city in comics, I think about big Art Deco presentations like Metropolis in Superman or Gotham City in Batman. What I wanted to highlight, though, is that there's a particular genre that also encompasses comics in addition to, superheroes and the like, and that is science fiction, and specifically the subgenre of cyberpunk. Now, to make sure we're all on the same page, because I'm sure my fellow academics in the room have the experience of talking very passionately to a group of people only to find out that nobody knows what the heck they're talking about. Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction, largely popularized in the 1980s in literature. Often considered the origin point for the genre is the novel Neuromancer by Canadian author William Gibson, published in 1982. Also notable for it is the film Blade Runner, based on a novella by Philip K. Dick, which came out the same year. And a lot of you have probably seen The Matrix, which would also be a big entry into this. And cyberpunk, in particular, has this big emphasis on things like cybernetic enhancement, questions of humanity and what it means to be human in a technological world, and most importantly for our discussion, dystopian postmodern cityscapes and what it means to move from the modern into the postmodern. Now, science fiction has been obsessed with the idea of the city of the future pretty much since its inception as a genre. Here you can see stills from very early science fiction films like Metropolis and Things to Come. Metropolis being a very foundational text in general, and Things to Come being based off the H.G. Wells novel of the same name. And this is commented on in a fascinating article by Gabriele Niola writing for the website Domus, that says, the idea was that vertical development could serve to show the difference between the social classes of a terrible future in which the skyscraper floor you occupied is a metaphor for your social status. Elite on the top, masses on the bottom. Thanks to many improvements and an ever-increasing precision, film after film, this model of city has grown to represent our idea of the future, the vertical megalopolis. And I would add that applies to something like Metropolis, but in things like Things to Come, a lot of these old visions of the future city were very utopian in depiction. They were very much meant to be an ideal vision of what our future could be. Cyberpunk opts to throw a wrench into this. And as explained by Gottesman, if modernism is the promised triumph of man and rationality over nature, then postmodernism is what you have when the modernization process is complete and nature is gone for good. Cyberpunk is the culmination of this movement aesthetically, in which not only is nature replaced by technology, but human beings as well, in which organs are replaced by artificial devices in a post-human phase of capitalism. And this kind of imagery, this idea of the post-human and the postmodern, is very visible in pretty much all cyberpunk medium. For starters, there's a still from the film Blade Runner, whose vision of Los Angeles itself is very much influenced by even then modern-day Hong Kong. When talking about comics, there's the very influential graphic novel series Transmetropolitan. Moving into anime with the film Ghost in the Shell, which itself is quite influential. And this is a trend that even continues into the modern day with the very recent release of the million-copy selling video game Cyberpunk 2077. Now, I imagine a lot of you are hearing this and going, okay, Matt, you're talking about movies and games and stuff, when are you getting to the comics? And what I want to get to is, in 1982, which you might be beginning to notice is a bit of a pivotal year for the genre, a little manga comes along in Japan called Akira. Akira is impossible to overstate the influence that it had on its genre, on its medium, and I would argue on comics in general. It originally ran in Japan from 1982 to 1990, published in 120 separate chapters throughout a regularly published magazine. It is about 3,500 pages in length in total, collected in 6 volumes that you can buy right now. If you haven't read it, I very much recommend you do so. Akira is a story about a kind of desolate but also futuristic future Japan that features biker gangs, martial law, a fascistic government, teenagers with psychic powers, and just about all manner of craziness you can think of, and it's fantastic. Especially well known in terms of Akira is the anime film adaptation of the same name that was made in 1988. It's probably the version that most people in North America know the best because it was brought here in the early 90s and very much was revolutionary in many ways. It actually was released here well before the manga ever got an official publication in English. And let alone, I don't even know when it was adapted into French, if it was at all. And it's also being remade currently, as the film only covers about 2 hours of a massive text, and the upcoming series, which I believe was supposed to be out already but was delayed because of COVID, is supposed to encompass even more of the original comic. But to talk about the influence of this comic, in its native Japan alone, during its initial run, with the prices of all the issues combined along with the collected volumes, it raised an estimated $170 to $250 million alone in Japan, and that's in the 1980s. As of September 2020, it is the collected editions that have been released worldwide have sold for over $141 million. And in fact, Kodansha Comics, who distribute it everywhere outside of Japan, recently announced that it's their first comic to receive over 100 print runs. And if you need to know any more examples of its influence in Japan, this is on the side of the construction of the actual Olympic stadium that was built for the Olympics that, again, were delayed because of COVID. And it's artwork straight up from Akira. And the reason I bring it up in this conference is because of the influence of its setting, which you might have seen in my title, which is Neo Tokyo is about to explode, which was the tagline that it was advertised with when the film was released in North America. And its main setting of Neo Tokyo is effectively, it's kind of almost more the main character in some ways than the actual main characters of the story are. For context, Neo Tokyo happens because in the timeline of this series, Tokyo is obliterated by a disaster evoking images of a nuclear disaster, although not quite the same thing, in 1989, and the ruins of the old city are actually left abandoned. There are several moments in the series that take place in the ruins of old Tokyo, so there are old landmarks and the like that are visible in the wreckage, but Tokyo is effectively abandoned. And Neo Tokyo itself is built on Tokyo Bay by 2019 in time to host the Summer Olympics. And if anyone's wondering about that, yes, this actually is one of the reasons Japan pushed really hard to get the Tokyo Olympics in 2020, is actually partially because of this manga. When designing Neo Tokyo, Katsuhiro Otomo, who I'm also going to mention in advance, also wrote, directed, and storyboarded the film that was adapted as well in a very rare case of adaptation. Talks about how, despite it being in the future, it's very rooted in the Japan of its day, and talks about, and he quotes, "There were so many interesting people, student demonstrations, bikers, political movements, gangsters, homeless youth, all part of the Tokyo scene that surrounded me. In Akira, I projected these elements into the future as science fiction." And the construction of the Olympic Stadium in Neo Tokyo, itself a central location to some of the big events that happen in the series and in the film, it is actually reminiscent of the construction of the first Olympic Stadium in Tokyo in 1964, which Otomo himself would have been, around for and would have been very aware of. And that actually was held as a very high mark for post-war Japan, coming out of the devastation of the war and kind of becoming their own sort of technological society. And here we have an example of things effectively moving from page to the screen. This is a reference photo taken from the film itself, drawn in exquisite, comic level detail. And commenting on this, writer Osmond states that when Akira's art director asked Otomo who would storyboard the film, as I mentioned, what the film's worldview would be, Otomo drew a dirty, grungy city sidewalk, the lived-in detail rivaling any live-action set. And Otomo actually commented as well, when I showed it to him, he explained, drawing like this will be impossible. And he mentions that the sign that you see in this image here, it's the name of a ramen shop. And he actually mentions there is an actual ramen shop in an area of Tokyo called Harukiya, which is the name on the sign. But he says that the scene there in particular is completely made up. And in particular, when the film was released in North America, a lot of attention was paid quite specifically to the detail and the vivid imagery of Neo-Tokyo and its skyscrapers, and the likes of which are straight from the comic page. But again, when this was released in the early 90s, we didn't have the comic here at the time. Speaking about the image itself, Time magazine at the time of the film's release commented that Neo-Tokyo is imagined down to the last noodle shop and intersection, a place of deep night and lurid neon that looks like Blade Runner on spoiled mushrooms. They also mentioned, and anime scholar Susan Napier mentions that, both regarding the manga and the film, that the destruction of the Olympic Stadium, which again is a key location in the film and the comic, and the vision of the dark crater at the center of Old Tokyo, Akira literally deconstructs Japan's recent past by blowing it away. And of course, this was also, the comic was originally published during the tail end of the Cold War when tensions were escalating again. And as such, if you watch any other Japanese media from the time, like a lot of Akira Kurosawa's later films, or a lot of other manga as well, like things like Fist of the North Star is a famous example. There are a lot of these recurring films of nuclear themes, I should say, of nuclear devastation in central Japan as a result, that with them being the one culture on Earth that has experienced the devastation of nuclear warfare firsthand. And the reason I bring all this up is because I just wanted to point out just how influential this setting of Neo-Tokyo is that all began with the comic. So first off, within its own sort of category of anime and manga, we have these images from manga whose comic and film adaptations would actually also find quite a huge audience in North America, such as Armitage the Third and Ghost in the Shell, both published in 1989. And although, as I mentioned before, Ghost in the Shell is heavily influenced by the design of Hong Kong. I would personally argue that, given that this was published 7 years after Akira began publication, I would argue that we wouldn't have one without the other. But it extends far beyond that. Neo-Tokyo is also extremely prevalent in film, for instance. For starters, there was an animated compilation of short films by multiple animators, one of which was done by Otomo himself, literally called Neo-Tokyo, or released here as Neo-Tokyo, also called Labyrinth Tales. And even recently, we've gotten such big-budget Hollywood productions as Battle Angel Alita, itself based on a manga series and produced, and the rights were actually purchased by James Cameron. And here we can see the influence, in my opinion, at least we can see the influence of Akira's art style pretty plainly. And it's kind of interesting to talk about this in association with film, because Otomo himself actually commented on the difference in working on film versus working on comics, despite himself starting off as a comic writer and artist as opposed to a director. And he commented during the production of Akira that it is extremely difficult to express the depth of such a vast city. In the comic, I used each issue to build more depth and size, but in a film, you get to combine this all into one. It's much more convincing. I could really create the type of environment that I wanted to depict. So it's kind of fascinating to see this transition happen from a primarily comic-oriented author. Moving on from there, the influence can be seen even far further than those mediums. For instance, the world of video games has latched on to cyberpunk and especially the Neo-Tokyo aesthetic in pretty major ways. Final Fantasy VII, for anyone who has played a video game at some point, I'm sure you've either played it or at least heard of it, especially with the current day remake. And the city streets here effectively look like the kind of thing that could have leapt straight from the pages of Otomo's comic, where you still see the decrepit city streets interspersed with the technology, and another just example I decided to pull for this is a recent game called Ghost Runner, released last year, which again looks like effectively like the page leapt onto screen. And it goes even further than that. If we want to talk about influence in other media, several genres of music, especially electronic music and subgenres like synthwave, have very much latched onto the aesthetic of Neo-Tokyo. For instance, we have this single by France-based synthwave artist Perturbator, who I was actually lucky enough to see in Montreal a few years ago before the pandemic started. And this is the artwork of the single Neo-Tokyo, the imagery of which is very much meant to evoke Akira and particularly the protagonist Kaneda and his motorcycle, which is by far the most famous imagery from the film itself and from the comic. And again, another band called Scandroid literally has an album called Dreams of Neo-Tokyo. And last but most certainly not least, if we want to see some examples in our present day, just life in general, one that I thought was a quite fun example was there's literally an anime store in London, Ontario called Neo Tokyo, the anime store. I am not familiar with it, but a friend of mine who lives in London, Ontario says it's located in one of the sketchiest areas of the city, which personally I think Otomo would love if he were to hear about that, but who knows. But the one that really stuck out for me is this is just a picture of Seoul, South Korea, taken 3 years ago. And I don't know about you, but if you got a chance to look closely at the imagery before, I'm sorry I blasted through the slides so quickly, but that just looks like Neo Tokyo to me. Like you could put that shot in a remake of Akira and I would just buy that that's the setting. And to close things off, I wanted to bring back that quote about the vertical development nature of science fiction city design, because I actually buried the lead a little bit and I left out part of the quote till the very end. Because this is actually taken from an article literally called "Welcome to Neo Tokyo, the most important city that you've never been to," published in 2019. And he adds, at the very end, after this description of the vertical megalopolis, the point of just think of the fact that today's Tokyo is not very different from Akira's Neo Tokyo. And I think that says it all when it comes to the influence of this comic. And I have some sources if you would like to look any of these up and read them for yourself. I apologize in advance if they're only available in English, but it's what I could find. So, thank you.